You touched a tree before. You placed your hand on the bark for a moment and then walked away, thinking nothing had happened. But something had already started inside your body the instant your skin approached that bark, something invisible and silent. And 7 days later, it was still unfolding inside you. You could not see it and you could not feel it, which is why almost nobody asked the real question. What exactly is a tree doing to the human body without medicine, without chemicals, simply through proximity? The answer is not mystical. It is physics. But to understand it, you must begin with a strange truth about reality. Look at your hands. Think about everything you touch today. A door handle, a phone. A coupe. It feels obvious that your skin contacted those objects. Yet physics says something different. You have never truly touched anything in your life. Not once. Electron clouds around atoms repel each other, leaving a tiny gap that never closes. When your hand rests on a tree, your skin never actually meets the bark, yet something still crosses that invisible space. You have touched thousands of things today. A door handle, a cup of coffee, the screen of your phone, the fabric of your clothes, the surface of a table. It feels obvious that your skin made contact with those objects. Your brain registers pressure, texture, temperature, and it tells you a simple story. You touched something. But physics tells a very different story. And once you see it clearly, it changes the way you think about every physical interaction in your life. At the scale of atoms, solid objects do not behave the way your senses imagine them. Every atom in your skin is surrounded by a cloud of electrons, a region of probability where negatively charged particles are most likely to exist. Every atom in the objects around you has the same structure, a dense nucleus surrounded by its own electron cloud. When your hand approaches a surface, those clouds approach each other long before the atomic nuclei could ever meet. And electrons do not like sharing space. They repel one another through the electromagnetic force, one of the four fundamental forces of the universe. The moment those electron clouds begin to overlap, the repulsion becomes extremely strong. The closer they get, the stronger the force pushing them apart. What you feel as the sensation of touch is not the merging of two materials. It is the resistance of those electron clouds refusing to occupy the same space. There is always a microscopic gap, an invisible distance maintained by electromagnetic repulsion. Your nerves detect the pressure created by that repulsion, and your brain interprets it as contact. But the atoms of your skin never truly collide with the atoms of the surface. In the strict language of physics, the nuclei never meet. This is why surfaces feel solid. It is not because matter is tightly packed like bricks in a wall, but because electromagnetic forces become incredibly strong at very short distances. When you press harder on a table, the electron clouds compress slightly. The repulsive force increases, and your nerves signal more pressure. Your brain translates that signal into the familiar feeling of pushing against something solid, but the gap remains. It is unimaginably small, far smaller than anything your senses can detect, yet it is always there. This means that every handshake you have ever given, every surface you have leaned on, every object you have held in your hand has been separated from your body by a thin field of force. You are not touching objects directly. You are interacting with their electromagnetic fields. The strange part is that your brain evolved to ignore this fact completely. Your nervous system converts the complex language of physics into a simple and useful illusion. It tells you that objects make contact because that interpretation helps you survive in a world of tools, surfaces, and obstacles. But underneath that illusion, Reality is operating according to a different rule. Matter rarely collides the way we imagine it. Instead, it pushes, repels, and stabilizes through invisible forces. Now consider what happens when you place your hand against the bark of a tree. Your skin does not merge with the bark any more than it merges with a table or a wall. Electron clouds in the atoms of your skin repel the electron clouds in the cellulose and lignin of the wood. The same electromagnetic barrier appears. The same tiny gap, the same field of force preventing true contact, yet something important is happening in that narrow space between you and the tree. The air between your skin and the bark is not empty. It is filled with moving molecules, drifting gases, and charged particles. Within that invisible region, physical processes can cross the gap even though the atoms themselves never touch. Heat can move through molecular motion. Electrons can flow through conductive pathways. And certain molecules released by the tree can travel through the air and enter your body with every breath. So the paradox is this: you never actually touch the tree. Yet the moment your hand approaches it, the tree begins interacting with your body through the physics of the space between you. That narrow gap, maintained by electromagnetic repulsion, becomes the stage where multiple physical mechanisms begin to operate at the same time. Most people never notice this because the processes are silent and invisible. You cannot see molecules drifting through the air. You cannot feel electrons moving through conductive pathways. You cannot sense the microscopic forces acting between atoms. But those processes are measurable, repeatable, and governed by precise physical laws. The simple act of placing your hand near the bark of a tree activates a set of interactions that begin in the physics of atoms and extend all the way into the biology of your immune system. And the first of those interactions begins with something constantly escaping from the surface of the tree into the air around it. Now, consider the air around the tree itself. It may look still and empty, but it is filled with molecules constantly leaving the surface of the bark and drifting outward into the surrounding space. Trees are not chemically silent structures. Every second, they release a stream of volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere around them. These molecules are small enough and light enough to escape from the liquid structures inside the plant and enter the gas phase at normal temperatures. The process is not mystical and it is not occasional. It is continuous. Physics determines whether a molecule becomes airborne. If its molecular mass is low enough and its vapor pressure is high enough, the forces holding the molecules together become weak compared to the energy of thermal motion in the air. When that threshold is crossed, the molecule escapes and begins moving freely through the atmosphere. Trees produce many of these compounds, molecules such as alpha-pinene, beta-pinene, limonene, and cineol. Together they are often grouped under a name that appears frequently in forest biology: phytoncides. The word was introduced in 1928 by the Russian biologist Boris Tokin. It literally means exterminated by the plant. These chemicals were not created to comfort humans or produce pleasant forest scents. They are part of the tree's defense system. Trees release them to suppress bacteria, fungi, and insects that threaten their survival. In other words, the tree is constantly conducting a quiet form of chemical warfare against microscopic life in its environment. Once these molecules enter the air, they obey the same physical rules that govern every gas on Earth. One of the most fundamental is diffusion. Gas molecules move randomly, but statistically they travel from regions of higher concentration toward regions of lower concentration. This creates a gradient spreading outward from the source. The surface of the bark is the point of highest concentration. As the molecules disperse, they form an expanding cloud that becomes gradually thinner with distance. The forest around the tree becomes a diffusion field. In a dense forest, this field overlaps from thousands of trees at once. Measurements in pine forests show that a single hectare of trees can release several kilograms of these airborne compounds every day. That means billions of molecules are constantly diffusing outward through the air around the trunks and leaves. The effect of this chemical diffusion is measurable in the environment itself. Air samples taken deep inside forests consistently show far fewer airborne bacteria compared with city air. In many forest environments, the bacterial concentration may drop to only a few hundred cells per cubic meter of air. While urban environments can contain several thousand, the airborne molecules released by trees act as antimicrobial agents that reduce the survival of microorganisms in the air around them. In a very literal sense, the forest is creating a cleaner atmospheric environment around itself. When you stand next to a tree, you are standing inside this diffusion cloud whether you realize it or not. When you move closer to the trunk, the concentration increases because you are approaching the source of the molecule. And when you place your hand near the bark, you are entering the region where those molecules are most concentrated in the surrounding air. Your lungs are constantly drawing air inward with each breath. At rest, the average person inhales roughly 6 to 8 liters of air every minute. Every one of those breaths carries the molecules drifting through the forest air into your respiratory system. Inside your lungs, the air reaches millions of tiny sacs called alveoli. The walls of these sacs are extremely thin, designed to allow gases and small molecules to cross into the bloodstream. Oxygen crosses this barrier every second to supply your cells with energy. But other airborne molecules can cross as well if they are small enough and chemically compatible with the biological membrane. The compounds released by trees fall within that range. They pass through the alveolar membrane and enter the circulation of your body. Once there, they begin interacting with the biological systems that regulate immunity and stress. In 2009, researchers led by Dr. Ching Lee at Nippon Medical School in Tokyo conducted a series of controlled studies to observe what happens when humans are exposed to these forest molecules. Participants spent time in forest environments where concentrations of phytoncides were high. Blood samples taken afterward revealed measurable changes in immune activity. A specific group of immune cells, known as natural killer cells, showed a significant increase in activity. These cells are responsible for identifying virus-infected cells and tumor cells and destroying them. The most striking part of the result was the duration. The increased activity of natural killer cells did not disappear after a few hours. It persisted for more than 7 days after a single exposure to forest air. When exposure lasted 2 or 3 days, the elevated immune activity remained for nearly a month. At the same time, the researchers measured stress hormones in urine samples and observed reductions in adrenaline and noradrenaline. The biochemical markers of the body's fight-or-flight response decreased in the presence of the forest environment. What makes this result remarkable is that the mechanism is simple and entirely physical. Molecules released by trees enter the air. Diffusion spreads them through the surrounding atmosphere. Breathing carries them into the lungs. The molecules cross into the bloodstream and interact with the immune system. No belief is required for the process to occur. It is governed by the same physics that moves oxygen into your blood every time you breathe. And all of it begins with invisible molecules drifting quietly away from the bark of a tree. While molecules drifting through the air explain one part of the interaction between your body and a tree, there's another process occurring at the same time that has nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with electricity. A tree is not just a biological structure. It is also an electrical conductor connected directly to the surface of the earth. Its roots penetrate the soil and remain in constant contact with the ground, which carries a measurable electrical charge. The planet itself functions as part of a global electrical circuit. At any given moment, roughly 2,000 thunderstorms are active somewhere on Earth, constantly transferring electrical charge between the atmosphere and the ground. These storms maintain a persistent negative charge across the surface of the planet. The soil beneath your feet is not electrically neutral. It contains a vast reservoir of mobile electrons distributed through minerals, water, and conductive pathways in the ground. When a conductive object touches the earth, electrons can move through that object and equalize electrical potential. A tree is part of that conductive pathway. Water within the trunk, dissolved ions in the sap, and the internal structure of plant tissue allow charge to move through the tree from its roots to the outer bark. When your skin comes into contact with the bark of a grounded tree, a connection forms between your body and that electrical system. Human skin is not a perfect conductor, but it is conductive enough, especially when slightly moist, for electrons to move across the surface and into the tissues beneath. The moment that contact occurs, electrons can flow from the earth through the tree and into your body until the electrical potential between the two systems stabilizes. This process is often described as grounding. It is not mystical. It is a simple transfer of charge between conductive bodies connected through a pathway. The interesting question is what that transfer of charge does once it enters the body. Human blood contains millions of red blood cells circulating through narrow vessels and capillaries. Each of those cells carries an electrical charge on its outer surface. This charge is known as the zeta potential. The magnitude of that charge determines how strongly the cells repel one another as they move through the bloodstream. When the charge is high, red blood cells push away from each other and remain evenly distributed in the plasma. When the charge decreases, the cells begin to clump together, forming stacks that resemble coins. This clumping increases the viscosity of the blood and makes circulation more difficult through the smallest vessels. In 2013, researchers studying electrical grounding observed that direct contact with the Earth's electrical potential could increase the zeta potential of red blood cells when participants were electrically connected to the ground. Measurements showed that their red blood cells repelled one another more strongly and separated more easily within the blood plasma. The result was a measurable decrease in blood viscosity. The mechanism was not chemical, it was electrical. Electrons entering the body altered the surface charge of the cells circulating through the bloodstream. The tree in this case functions as a natural conductive bridge between your body and the electrical reservoir of the earth beneath it. At the same time, another effect is quietly influencing your nervous system through a completely different branch of physics. This third mechanism has nothing to do with molecules or electrons. It is about heat. When you wrap your hand around a metal railing on a cold morning, it feels immediately freezing. The metal seems to suck warmth out of your skin. When you touch wood under the same conditions, it feels noticeably warmer and more comfortable. The common assumption is that the wood somehow gives warmth to your hand. In reality, the opposite is happening. The difference lies in thermal conductivity, the rate at which a material transfers heat energy. Metals conduct heat extremely efficiently. The atoms inside the metal rapidly transfer thermal energy away from your skin and disperse it through the structure of the material. Your nerves interpret this rapid loss of heat as cold. Wood behaves very differently. Its internal structure is composed of cellulose fibers and microscopic air pockets that slow the movement of heat dramatically. Wood conducts heat roughly 1,000 times more slowly than most metals. When you place your hand against a tree trunk, the wood does not quickly pull heat away from your skin. Your body retains its warmth. The temperature of your skin remains relatively stable. Your nervous system cannot easily distinguish between an object that actively provides heat and an object that simply fails to remove it. As a result, your brain interprets the stable warmth as comfort, as if the tree itself were giving you something. But the tree is not providing warmth. It is simply not stealing it. Your nervous system transforms that physical difference in conductivity into a subjective experience of calm and warmth. So 3 different mechanisms are operating simultaneously in the narrow space between your skin and the bark of a tree. Molecules diffuse through the air and enter your body through breathing. Electrons travel through a conductive pathway from the earth into your tissues. And the thermal properties of wood shape the signals your nervous system interprets as comfort. None of these processes require belief or intention. They emerge directly from the laws of physics governing matter, electricity, and heat, and all of them are already happening long before you stop to think about the tree itself. Now shift your attention away from what the tree does to your body and consider the tree itself. Think about what it actually is. A mature oak tree can weigh several tons. A large forest tree may contain thousands of kilograms of solid material in its trunk, end branch, and roots. According to one of the oldest and most reliable principles in physics, conservation of mass, that material had to come from somewhere. Matter cannot appear from nothing. Every atom in that tree existed before the tree itself existed. So the question becomes simple and surprisingly difficult at the same time. Where did all that mass come from? The obvious answer most people imagine is the soil. The roots grow into the ground, absorb nutrients and minerals, and the tree slowly builds its body from the material beneath it. That explanation feels intuitive. But in the 17th century, a scientist decided to test that assumption with unusual patience and precision. His name was Jan Baptista van Helmont. In 1648, he designed an experiment that would become one of the most elegant demonstrations in early biology. Van Helmont took a large clay pot and filled it with 200 pounds of dry soil that he'd carefully weighed beforehand. Into that soil, he planted a small willow sapling weighing about 5 pounds. To prevent outside contamination, he covered the pot with a perforated metal plate so that only water could enter while dust and debris were kept out. For the next 5 years, he watered the plant only with rainwater or distilled water and allowed it to grow. At the end of those 5 years, he removed the tree from the pot and weighed everything again with the same careful method. The willow tree had grown dramatically. It now weighed approximately 169 pounds. That meant it had gained more than 160 pounds of solid mass in wood, bark, leaves, and roots. Van Helmont then dried the soil again and weighed it once more. The soil had lost less than 2 ounces of its original weight. In other words, the enormous mass of the tree had not come from the soil. The minerals and nutrients in the ground contributed only a tiny fraction of the tree's total structure. Van Helmont concluded that the additional mass must have come from the water he had added during the experiment. It was a reasonable guess because water was the only substance entering the system over those 5 years. But later discoveries revealed that even this explanation was incomplete. To understand why, consider what wood is actually made of. If you analyze the chemical composition of dry wood, you will find that roughly half of its mass consists of carbon atoms. Carbon forms the structural backbone of cellulose and lignin, the long molecular chains that give wood its strength and rigidity. Water contains hydrogen and oxygen, but no carbon. Soil contains trace minerals such as calcium, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, and iron. Yet together, these minerals account for only a small percentage of the tree's dry weight. The overwhelming majority of the material forming the trunk and branches is carbon. So where did that carbon come from? The answer was surrounding Van Helmont the entire time he conducted his experiment. It came from the air. Carbon dioxide makes up only a tiny fraction of Earth's atmosphere, roughly 400 parts per million. But it provides the primary source of carbon for every plant on the planet. Through microscopic pores on their leaves, called stomatotrees, draw carbon dioxide from the surrounding air. Inside the leaf, an extraordinary process powered by sunlight begins. Photons from the sun strike chlorophyll molecules and excite electrons to higher energy states. That captured energy flows through a chain of molecular reactions that produce ATP. the universal energy currency of living cells. The energy stored in ATP is then used to break apart the highly stable carbon dioxide molecule. The carbon atom is separated from its oxygen partners and incorporated into a series of reactions known as the Calvin cycle. There, the carbon atoms are assembled into glucose molecules composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These glucose molecules become the raw building blocks of the plant. They are linked together into long repeating chains that form cellulose, the primary structural component of plant cell walls. Additional complex polymers such as lignin reinforce these structures and give wood its remarkable hardness and durability. The oxygen atoms released from carbon dioxide during this process are expelled back into the atmosphere as oxygen gas. Every breath of oxygen you inhale exists because plants perform this chemical transformation somewhere on Earth. When you look at a tree trunk, you are not just looking at wood. You are looking at carbon atoms that once drifted invisibly through the air as carbon dioxide. Those atoms were captured from the atmosphere, energized by sunlight traveling 93 million miles from the sun, and locked into chemical bonds that form solid matter. In the most literal sense, a tree is built from air. The massive trunk of a forest giant is composed largely of atoms that once floated freely in the atmosphere. Sunlight provided the energy that rearranged those atoms into stable structures. Over years and centuries, the tree accumulated layer upon layer of this material, ring by ring, converting invisible gas into solid wood. What appears to be a massive object rising from the soil is in reality a slow crystallization of the atmosphere itself. For most of human history, we imagined a forest as a collection of separate trees, each trunk rising from the ground like an individual organism competing with its neighbors for sunlight, water, and nutrients. The image seems obvious when you walk through the woods. Each tree stands alone, rooted in its own patch of soil. But that picture turns out to be incomplete. Beneath the forest floor, there exists a system of connections so dense and so widespread that the forest behaves less like a crowd of individuals and more like a single distributed network. The key to that network is not the tree itself, but fungi living in the soil. Tree roots rarely grow alone. At the tips of those roots live microscopic fungal partners that form symbiotic relationships with plants. These fungi extend thread-like structures called hyphae outward through the soil, exploring volumes of earth far beyond the reach of the roots themselves. The threads are incredibly thin, thinner than a human hair, yet they can extend for meters and eventually connect with the roots of other trees nearby. When millions of these fungal threads intertwine, they form what biologists call a mycorrhizal network. Inside a single teaspoon of healthy forest soil, there may be kilometers of these microscopic filaments. Together they create a vast web linking tree after tree beneath the ground. For decades, scientists assumed these connections simply help trees absorb nutrients from the soil more efficiently. But in the early 1990s, a young forest ecologist named Suzanne Simard began to suspect that something more complex was happening. She was working in the forests of British Columbia, studying why newly planted tree seedlings often died in clear-cut areas where older trees had been removed. According to traditional ecological theory, the seedlings should have thrived. With the large trees gone, there was more sunlight, more space, and less competition for resources. Yet the seedlings struggled and often failed to survive. Simard proposed a different explanation. She suspected the seedlings were dying because the underground fungal networks connecting them to mature trees had been destroyed during the logging process. If those networks were carrying resources between trees, then cutting the forest apart would also sever the channels that moved those resources. To test this idea, she designed an experiment that was both simple and ingenious. She placed transparent bags around the branches of specific trees and injected air containing carbon dioxide labeled with radioactive carbon isotopes. The trees absorbed this carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and incorporated the labeled carbon into their tissues. Then she waited and monitored nearby trees that had never been exposed to the radioactive gas. Using sensitive detectors, she discovered something remarkable. The radioactive carbon appeared in neighboring trees that had not been given the tracer. The carbon had moved underground from one tree to another through the mycorrhizal network linking their root systems. Carbon, water, and nutrients were flowing through the fungal web connecting the forest. Later studies mapped these underground connections in greater detail. Researchers discovered that the network does not distribute connections evenly. Instead, it follows a pattern known in network science as a scale-free structure. In such systems, most nodes have only a few connections, while a small number of nodes have extremely many. These highly connected nodes act as hubs that stabilize and organize the network. In a forest, those hubs are usually the oldest and largest trees. Their root systems and fungal partners form the central junctions through which large amounts of carbon and nutrients pass. Younger trees often connect into the network through these hubs. Simard began referring to these large central trees as mother trees. The name was not metaphorical sentiment, but a description of observed behavior. Studies showed that large mature trees often send carbon through the network to nearby seedlings, especially those that share genetic similarity. In shaded environments where young trees cannot photosynthesize efficiently, the carbon supplied by neighboring trees can significantly improve survival rates. Seasonal exchanges can occur as well. In some forests, deciduous trees send carbon to evergreen neighbors during summer when the evergreen canopy is shaded. In winter, the direction of flow can reverse when the deciduous trees lose their leaves and photosynthesis stops. The network can also transmit warning signals. When insects begin attacking one tree, chemical signals can travel through the fungal threads to neighboring trees, triggering defensive responses before the insects arrive. The forest, in a sense, shares information. None of this means trees possess consciousness or intention in the human sense. The system operates through chemical gradients, diffusion, and biological feedback mechanisms shaped by evolution. But the result is unmistakable. A forest behaves like an interconnected system rather than a simple group of isolated organisms. When you stand beside a single tree, you are not encountering an individual life form in isolation. You are touching a node in a network that spreads beneath the soil in every direction, carrying carbon, nutrients, and signals through microscopic threads that have been connecting the forest for centuries. Some trees on Earth have been alive longer than entire civilizations. In the White Mountains of California, there is a species known as the bristlecone pine. One individual tree there, often referred to as Methuselah, is more than 4,800 years old. It was already growing when the pyramids of Egypt were still young. It was alive before the Roman Empire existed. It continued photosynthesizing through the rise and fall of cultures, through wars, migration, and the entire written history of much of humanity. When people first hear numbers like that, the natural question is simple. How can a living organism survive for so long? Every animal ages. Every human body carries a biological clock that slowly moves toward decline. Cells accumulate damage over time. DNA develops copying errors. Structures inside the cell begin to malfunction. Eventually, tissues lose the ability to repair themselves and the organism dies. This process is known as biological aging, and it is built into the design of animal life. But trees follow a very different strategy. The key lies in a special type of tissue found in plants called meristematic tissue. These are regions where cells remain capable of continuous division. You can find them at the tips of branches, at the ends of roots. And in a thin layer just beneath the bark known as the cambium, The cambium is responsible for producing new wood toward the inside of the trunk and new bark toward the outside. Every year it adds another thin ring of growth to the tree. As long as the cambium remains alive and functional, the tree can continue generating new tissues indefinitely. The remarkable part is that the cells within these regions do not appear to follow the same aging pattern seen in most animal cells. In animals, the ends of chromosomes are protected by structures called telomeres. Each time a cell divides, those telomeres become slightly shorter. Over time, they reach a critical length and the cell loses its ability to divide properly. This is one of the mechanisms behind aging in animals. But many plants maintain active levels of an enzyme called telomerase within their dividing tissues. Telomerase rebuilds and extends telomeres, effectively resetting that biological clock. Studies examining extremely old trees have found that telomerase activity can remain high even in individuals thousands of years old. The cells in the cambium of these ancient trees show little sign of knowing how old the organism itself is. From the perspective of cellular biology, the tissue is still capable of dividing and producing new growth. This means the tree does not age in the same way animals do. It continues renewing itself layer by layer, ring after ring, year after year. Longevity in trees also comes from the way their bodies are organized. A tree does not rely on a single central organ the way animals rely on a heart or brain. Instead, it is built from repeating modules of branches, leaves, and roots. Damage to one part of the structure does not necessarily destroy the whole organism. A large tree may lose limbs, sections of bark, or even significant portions of its trunk while the rest of the living tissue continues functioning. In the case of bristlecone pines, much of the tree can actually be dead wood, while only a narrow strip of living tissue remains active. The dead wood becomes extremely dense and saturated with resin, protecting the structure from rot and decay. The living cambium may occupy only a thin ribbon winding up the trunk, connecting a small section of roots with a cluster of needles high above the ground. Yet that small living pathway is enough to keep the organism alive. Another factor contributing to extreme longevity is the slow pace of growth. Bristlecone pines grow in harsh mountain environments with poor soil, strong winds, and limited water. These conditions force the tree to grow very slowly, sometimes adding only fractions of a millimeter of wood each year. Slow growth reduces mechanical stress and allows the tree to conserve energy. The needles themselves can remain attached for decades, continuing to photosynthesize year after year without needing to be replaced every season. This reduces the energy cost of producing new foliage. Over centuries, these small advantages accumulate. The tree becomes a structure designed not for speed but for endurance. When you stand beside such a tree, you are looking at a living organism that has been quietly converting sunlight and carbon dioxide into wood for thousands of years without any internal program telling it to stop. Its cells continue dividing. Its cambium continues adding rings. The biological machinery that maintains the organism remains functional across spans of time that exceed the lifetime of entire civilizations. If trees can renew their cells indefinitely and maintain active growth for thousands of years, then a new question appears. Why do they ever die at all? If their biology does not contain the same built-in aging clock that limits animal life, what eventually brings them to an end? The answer is not found inside the cells of the tree. The answer comes from the external rules governing matter, energy, and structure. Trees do not die because their biology fails. They die because physics eventually breaks the structures that biology builds. To understand this, imagine what a tree is mechanically. It is a massive vertical structure made from wood, anchored in soil, supporting thousands of kilograms of weight above the ground. Every branch, every leaf, every layer of the trunk adds mass and increases the forces acting on the structure. One of the first limits comes from wind. Wind force acting on an object increases with the surface area exposed to the moving air. As a tree grows taller, its crown expands and the area catching the wind grows rapidly. During storms, the wind does not simply push on the leaves. It creates a bending force at the base of the trunk, known as a bending moment. The higher the tree grows, the longer the lever arm between the crown and the ground. This means the mechanical stress at the base increases dramatically. A tree twice as tall does not experience twice the stress. The forces grow far more quickly because both height and surface area increase together. Even a healthy tree with perfectly functioning cells can eventually snap when wind loads exceed the strength of the wood fibers holding the trunk together. Another limit emerges from the way trees transport water. Unlike animals, trees have no heart or pump to move fluids through their bodies. Water travels upward through microscopic tubes in the wood called xylem. The driving force is a tension created by evaporation at the leaves. As water evaporates from the leaf surface, it pulls the next molecule upward, and that molecule pulls the next one behind it. The entire column of water behaves like a chain being pulled upward from the top. This system works because water molecules stick to one another through cohesion. But as a tree grows taller, the tension required to pull water from the roots to the leaves becomes greater and greater. At extreme heights, the pressure inside the water columns becomes so negative that dissolved gases can suddenly form bubbles. When that happens, the water column breaks, a phenomenon known as cavitation. Once a bubble forms, the continuous chain of water is interrupted, and that transport pathway stops functioning. Large trees have many parallel pathways, but widespread cavitation can eventually reduce the ability of the tree to supply water to its leaves. Height, therefore, introduces a physical ceiling determined by the properties of water itself. The tallest trees on Earth, the coastal redwoods reaching around 115 meters, are already approaching this limit, where the physics of water transport becomes extremely difficult to sustain. There is also a deeper structural constraint known as the square-cube law. When an object grows larger, its volume and mass increase with the cube of its size, while the strength of its supporting structures increases only with the square. For a tree, this means that as height increases, the weight of the trunk and branches grows faster than the cross-sectional strength of the wood supporting them. Each additional ring of growth makes the structure heavier and increases the stress within the trunk. Biology can continue producing new cells, but the geometry of the structure eventually works against it. Gravity pulls on every kilogram of wood that the tree adds to itself. Lightning provides another reminder that the environment does not care how healthy a tree's cells may be. Tall trees are often the highest conductive points in a landscape, making them natural targets for electrical discharge during storms. A single strike can split the trunk or ignite fires within the wood. Fire itself is another physical force capable of destroying centuries of growth in a matter of hours. Drought can interrupt the water transport system. Insects can exploit small structural injuries and open pathways for decay. None of these events occur because the tree has reached a biological expiration date. They occur because the physical world eventually delivers stresses that exceed what the structure can tolerate. In that sense, a tree is a biologically persistent organism living inside an engineering problem that grows more difficult every year. Its cells could continue dividing. Its cambium could keep adding new layers. The machinery of life inside the tree does not know how old the organism is. But gravity, wind, water tension, and fire operate according to physical laws that never stop applying pressure to the structure. Sooner or later, one of those forces wins. When you stand beside a tree, you are looking at a living system balanced between two worlds. Biology pushes the organism to continue growing and renewing itself. Physics quietly counts down the stresses accumulating in the structure And eventually physics writes the final line of the story.